Hi, my name is Zev Eigen. I am the Global Director of Data Analytics with Littler Mendelson, a management side labor and employment law firm. I am going to tell you a lot about a topic that if you're not already thinking about, it's something you need to think about because either through your law firm or your clients, it's hard to imagine how the topic of big data and predictive analytics isn't already a part of your clients' lives or your lives, as we'll soon discover. I have approximately 10 years worth of experience as a data scientist doing artificial intelligence programming, machine learning, and related econometric and statistics work as an expert and as a researcher and a former professor. I've served in many different capacities. As you'll see in this slide, the overview slide, what we're going to talk about today is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk through what is big data or what are data that are large, and what does predictive analytics mean, and how are predictive analytics being used to make business decisions. Then we'll talk about what the legal risks are of data-driven decision making. And we'll talk lastly about what role there is for law and lawyers and legal services generally in this space of big data and predictive analytics. So often when I give talks to crowds of data scientists or statisticians or technical folks, I start off with a joke written by an artificial intelligence algorithm. So if you're worried about artificial intelligence taking over your job as a lawyer, you might ponder whether AI or artificial intelligence could take over the job of a stand-up comedian. Here's an example of a joke written by an artificial intelligence algorithm. Prepare yourself for the genius. What do you get when you cross an optic with a mental object? What do you get when you cross an optic with a mental object? And the answer is an idea, E-Y-E-D-A. Apparently, by the way, the two groups of people for whom AI-written jokes do very well are children, because they're mostly puns, and artificial intelligence programmers. That's about it. So I'll start out with this slide, which is a photo of the very first 5 megabyte hard disk, and you'll see it's the size of about 2 refrigerators, and this is in 1956, and you see the hard drive being lifted onto a Pan Am plane, and it's very delicate. So the system consists of 50 24-inch platters that are spinning, and it's not a stable system. So it was very, very expensive and very easy for it to break. It was manufactured by IBM in the RAMAC 305 system, and it cost $10,000 per megabyte. Here is a 3 terabyte drive that you can buy for $50 or $60 in 2016, and you see it fits in the palm of your hand. The basic idea for why there has been such an exponential explosion in the use and application of big data and predictive modeling is not so much in the math. Most of the underlying math, the theoretical math and the math that's used in the cases that we're going to talk about today are old or newish. Some of the math comes from the 60s. Some of it comes from the 70s, 80s, 90s. But what really has caused the growth of big data and its application and predictive modeling is the change of the model of data flow. So even when the internet started, most of the way in which information flowed was from an employer or business entity to employees or consumers. The new model of data flow is bidirectional. Surely information can still go from an employer or a business to its consumers or employees, but actually the vast majority of information now can flow in the other direction And that information is extremely valuable. So information about how users behave, what their processes are for arriving at a product, what their traits are, what their preferences are, as evidenced by their behavior and their purchasing behaviors and predilections. Those are all, and actually in healthcare information as well, those are all pieces of information that can flow from the employee or the consumer or individual writ large towards the employer or the business entity. And that's really what we mean by big data. It's either information that is very large or very complex or high velocity. So as an example, I'm wearing a Fitbit. This is a piece of wearable technology that's generating information about my heart rate, about my step count, about where, even GPS data from your phone. If you have a smartphone, you could think of that GPS data as being maybe not super complicated. It's just a point of where you are and a geopositional location piece of information, a piece of data. But if you imagine that piece of information being stretched out in an array just for one person over the course of a day, and then a week, and then a month, and then year, and then years, that's why this is called big data, or in this case, it's because it's high velocity. In other words, it's coming in very rapidly. It's updating every second or every 2 seconds. So if you think of self-driving cars, that's high velocity data that's being processed, right? Because the data is being taken from a video imaging, that's being processed very quickly, and that data is coming in and being processed in a high velocity manner. So as you see in this slide too, this is something that's kind of interesting and also an indication of where things are going with this kind of high velocity data. This is from a survey that asked, the North American Technological Consumer Survey, asked how would you be interested in wearing or using a sensor device, assuming it was from a brand you trust, offering a service that interests you. As you see, 29% said they're okay with it being clipped onto their clothing, 28% said they're okay with it being on their wrist, and so on and so forth, glasses, upper arm. But my favorite is the 3% that said they're okay with being tracked with something that's tattooed onto your skin. So you can imagine the sort of ideas of how both predictive modeling and big data can be used, as we'll discuss further, for very great purposes. And in some instances, it's called the data for good movement. And you could think of applications where you could predict things that are of phenomenal value for everybody, like allocating scarce resources, charitable resources, or optimizing health outcomes for patients, or optimizing employment outcomes for people who need the assistance. But you could also see the way in which the use cases could go sideways, both in terms of the law and in terms of ethical or moral concerns about the misuse or abuse of those predictive models and data. So what has happened in the past 5 to 7 years is the realization that that information, that bidirectional flow of information, is monetizable. And you see here examples of different ways of saying that data are the newest form of currency, that these are the information themselves, the data themselves, are a way of pushing business decisions and in fact driving profitability for organizations. In fact, Forbes noted that machine learning is a top strategic trend for 2016 and rendered the prediction that machine learning will be a necessary element for data preparation and predictive analysis in businesses moving forward. And here you see the clip from the business value of predictive analytics from the IDC, noting that there's a 250% return on investment from business analytics solutions that incorporate predictive analytics. And we'll talk more about what that means, but essentially it means using big data as a way of predicting what's going to happen next. In fact, according to venturescanner.com, there are 957 artificial intelligence companies across 13 categories with a combined estimated funding of $4.8 billion. These organizations use big data as a way to help organizations render business decisions across a whole slew of areas, which we'll discuss. And as you see in this slide, big data are sources of information, either transactions, observations, or interactions that are too big or fast for traditional analysis. And over time, because of the increasing quality and availability of data sources like the ones we mentioned, wearable technology, using computers, using PDAs, using anything that enables that bidirectionality, that flow of information from the consumer, employer, individual to the organization, that enables that proliferation of those available data and the increase in storage capacity and computing power has enabled both a growth in the availability of making predictions and the reliability of making predictions. One example of an area that is near and dear to my heart of substantial growth in this space in the last 5 years, which has couldn't be more relevant to the question of what role does law have in predictive modeling, is HR, or people analytics. This is the idea of using predictive modeling and big data to inform HR decision making. So an example would be predicting who is likely to be a good employee based on available data, even sometimes publicly available data, as I'll describe in more detail. It could also be used in creating turnover models, predicting who's likely to leave the company in the next 6 months. Again, with sometimes a surprising degree of accuracy, in part because some of the data are very hard to system game. If your employer came to you and said, "Are you leaving?" and you said no, okay, it is what it is. But there are other indicia of behaviors that might show or indicate that you're going out the door, you're leaving in the next 6 months, that are very hard to system game, they're very hard to fake. And observing those data can arm an employer with very useful information, but also there's a risk of being armed with that useful information, and that's the role of law. So I would say in the last 5 to 7 years, you've seen this growth of HR prediction modeling and HR or people analytics, in part because it's available, we have the data, and in part because it's very profitable. HR organizations that regularly use data to make talent and HR strategy decisions generate 30% greater stock returns than the S&P 500 over the last 3 years. Okay, so let's get into the weeds a little bit about what we're talking about with predictive modeling, what are the kinds of things data science can do, and what are the categories of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and predictive modeling, and big data analytics that we're talking about here, just so we understand what we're dealing with before we get into the questions of what role, if any, law should play in this space. So maybe a good place to start is the question, what is a data scientist? Originally, the term data scientist was coined, I think, with probably with Facebook, because Facebook was one organization that employed statisticians and programmers. And the statisticians and programmers at Facebook worked together to find ways of monetizing user data that they were gathering and using in one part of the business, in advertising, but not necessarily in other parts of the business. And the term data scientist was born out of this combination of these two skill sets of programming and being able to scrape data and understand how to program, often in languages like R or Python, but there are others, and having a background in matrix algebra, linear algebra, and calculus and statistics. So having those two core skills is sort of the hallmark of what a data scientist is. On this slide, you'll see the, sometimes the often referenced tongue-in-cheek definition of an analyst by Edmund Jackson is as someone who lives an analyst who lives in California, because that most of the businesses employing data scientists originally were in Silicon Valley and California broadly. And I like this definition by Michael Driscoll. They're better statisticians than most programmers and better programmers than most statisticians. But essentially, data scientists are creative, academically curious folks with those skills who are employed by organizations to find ways of using and monetizing data to inform decisions. And those decisions span the gamut. They can be in advertising, they can be in driving decisions around staffing, they can be in driving decisions about investing, or a whole array of other areas. There are 4 distinct data-driven services. Data can be used to benchmark, essentially make a decision of why A is performing better than B, right? This is sometimes referred to as A/B testing or experimenting. Data can also be used for recommendation and filter systems, and these can be either content-based recommendation engines or collaborative filtering or a hybrid. Recommendation engines, an example of recommendation engine which most may be familiar with is LinkedIn. So that's recommending people you may know. That's a series of algorithms that are looking at lots of information simultaneously and rendering a prediction about people you may know and may want to connect with. Or Amazon's recommendation based on reading behavior of books in which you might be interested. Or a classic example of a terrific recommendation engine success story is Google. Essentially, Google is where it is historically because it had a better recommendation engine under the hood than Alta Vista, its main competitor, when those two entities were fighting for the space of optimal web searching. Thirdly, data can be used for predictions, right? And this is the idea of, you can even think of an example of any logistics company or ride-sharing company like Uber or FedEx or UPS. Those entities use data to render predictions about what is the optimal route for getting from point A to point B, right? So if you're going from point A to point B, that's a future event. No one knows for sure how long it's going to take to go from point A to point B, and let's say there are 4 different possible routes. Which route should the UPS driver, FedEx driver, or Uber driver take to go from point A to point B? Or in Uber's case, or any ride-sharing company's case, which driver is the closest to the person requesting a ride? That's an example of prediction. But of course, there are plenty more examples of using data for predictions, as already mentioned, in healthcare, health outcomes, marketing, or HR. And then lastly, data can be used to describe and understand statistical relationships. And often this is, the 4th category is not considered something that is part of the artificial intelligence or machine learning systems. But data can be used in a way that advances the ball a lot in understanding relationships between or among categories of things to help render business decisions. An example might be site selection. If you're an entity and you're trying to choose your next retail store location, how do you understand the relationship between lots and lots of information around which you might parameterize for deciding which site would be best and optimizing the outcome of picking one site with limited resources? Okay, so you can break down, I think it's useful to think about this division of categories of applications of AI and machine learning. And here I've used as a source Venture Scanner. They came up with 13 categories. I've compartmentalized the 13 down to 10. And on this slide, you'll see the ones that are highlighted in the darker green as being ones that I think are more susceptible to or areas where law would be most applicable or fruitfully applied. So very briefly, thinking through these, you see the first one is deep learning or machine learning. And that is essentially the space with which you may have heard through the media of IBM or Google's systems that are programmed computer systems that are learning and updating as they go. There are probably more complex explanations available for what deep learning or machine learning is, but it's on the spectrum of closer to more unsupervised learning, where systems are updating and improving as they go. And so an example would be chess or Go, most recently, as being systems that look at lots of information and observe lots of information and glean from that observation how to optimize an algorithm or set of algorithms to render decisions. So in chess, which piece to move, or in Go, where to put a piece, right? But that can be applied to many other settings. So there's deep learning or machine learning, and that's an area for sure in which law could and should play more of a role. The second is natural language processing. The third is computer vision and image recognition. The fourth is gesture control. The fifth is virtual personal assistants. The sixth is smart robots. Then there's recommendation engines and collaborative filtering. And I would say, again, the recommendation engines and collaborative filtering, that's, again, where we're trying to make predictions using artificial intelligence, machine learning, or other big data algorithms. And again, that's where law really can and should play a role. And the last three are context-aware computing. I think that's the only one that might need additional explanation. That's the idea of software that is interacting with the user in a way that's meaningful. So it's not just a unidirectional interaction where you're telling software or you're telling a form or you're telling a website what you want or what you're looking for. The form or the website or the software is interacting with you. Then the last two categories are speech-to-speech translation, and lastly, video automatic content recognition. And the last one is, I mean, all these are fascinating areas, but you see areas 1, 2, and 7 as being the ones I've identified as being very, very readily available for law to play a role, either in understanding what things are going into the model and ensuring that those things are compliant with the law, or understanding how, when the predictions are made, how that information is being used in a way that is both ethical and in compliance with the law. So you'll see here, exactly to that point, a diagram of a neural network. And I'm not going to get into the math that's underlying neural networks, but I think it's important to understand the basic idea to do exactly what I just said, to understand where law can have a role here. So the idea behind this is a very straightforward and a commonly used system that's diagrammed out here. And the basic idea, it looks a little complicated because of the balls and the lines and everything, but it's actually relatively simple and straightforward conceptually. And here's how it works. Inputs. There's a ton of inputs that go into something. And the inputs can be things that make sense, and sometimes they can be things that may or may not make sense. Those inputs then are looked at in lots of different ways. Are they related to one another? How many ways in which you can weight or relate them to each other? And then the system is generating an output, a set of outputs, from which there's an optimal path that emerges over time. I'll give you an example to think through this conceptually. Let's say you wanted to hire people and you wanted to videotape them being interviewed for the job. So what you could do is send them a link to questions that populate in real time. You could fabricate the questions ahead of time, and you could send them a link to something that's going to videotape them at home interviewing for the position for which you're hiring. And what the video information is taking back to you is a set of things. In fact, it's a ton of things. It's surely taking the audio and the video and the substantive answers, which you might want to listen to and pay attention to. But it's also gathering lots and lots of other big data. So for instance, how many times does the interviewee tilt her head to the left? How many seconds is the head tilted to the right off of center? How many times does the interviewee use the word and or the letter T, right? You could think of literally hundreds of thousands of parameters or features that are going into that data set. What big data could do here is compare all that information in ways that may be obvious but might not be obvious to outcomes. So if you have training data or information about how people were interviewed and then how they perform on the job, you could then train a system, an AI system, to improve over time at predicting from these hundreds of thousands of micro parameters who's going to be a good employee, right? And they might be things that are in that model that are not intuitive, right? So it might be the case, let's hypothesize, I'm making this up, but let's hypothesize leaning your head to the left is more associated with good performance on the job than keeping your head straight or leaning it to the right. I'm making that up. That's not a real effect, but that's not something that's intuitive, right? That's not something that we would have hypothesized ahead of time would have any effect. And surely it's not just that effect. It's that effect in conjunction with lots and lots of others. But it's important to understand this because that's the idea. There are a lot of features that are going into this model, some of which may be very intuitive, some of which are not. Some of which are meaningless unless they're weighted in conjunction with lots of other things. And lastly, it's important to note that the system is not thinking. It's not a person, which is good and bad. It's good because it does not have any heuristics or suffer from any biases that are exogenous to the system, that are outside the scope of the parameters that are being fed into it. But simultaneously, that's bad because it's also blind to things that are not going in the model that might be very important. For instance, in this example, if the substance of the interview, if the person just did all the things right, they tilted their head to the left, they said all these other things, but even with the prediction model, they said things that were nonsensical, or they said things that were hateful. Let's say they expressed hate speech in the interview. Let's say they expressed competence, but simultaneously expressed hate speech in the interview, right? That might be something that the algorithm may not be paying attention to or may not pick up, but without human intervention, without understanding the relationship between the features and how they're being used and how to apply the result, if that's lost, that would be a problem. So that's an area ripe for legal intervention. Okay, so let's talk briefly, since we're on this subject, of the value before we get to the risks and the downside. What are the values, or what was the intrinsic value of applying a data scientific or data analytic approach to decision making in organizations? So I've listed these four. Surely, as we just discussed, it reduces bias. And when I say reduces bias, I mean both the legal kind of bias and also the bias that is not necessarily illegal, but is inefficient. So I just gave you an example of a way in which an algorithm reduces legal bias, right? Because it's blind to things like protected categories enumerated by federal and state law. So it cannot consider those things unless those things are included in the model. If they're not included in the model, it is an unbiased, in a legal sense, an unbiased decision-making system. The other good thing is that it doesn't suffer, the algorithms won't suffer from things like heuristic bias. I'll give you an example of that. That's not something that's illegal per se, but creates suboptimal decision-making in humans. Humans are great at some decision-making and terrible at others. Lawyers are a good example of this, as everyone else is. So let's say, this is an example I think from a relatively recent study on parole board hearings. If you have a parole board hearing by humans and simultaneously you have an algorithm that's looking at lots and lots of data points and features and all the things we're discussing as a way of predicting whether a potential a person should be granted parole or not, right? That's a prediction engine. That would be what that's doing. And you had that system, that operative algorithm system running side by side with humans. Here's a problem with the way humans render decisions. Generally speaking, humans in this case want to be fair and they want to be just. And part of that that's great, but the problem is that it's very hard to disentangle that perception, that self-perception that's imposed on the judgment being made with the necessity to separate out the decision making for each person. So for instance, if you have 4 people in a row who you're going to hear, and person 1 you grant parole to, person 2 you grant parole to, person 3 you grant parole to, evidence suggests that this 4th person, the likelihood of that person being granted parole, independent of anything else, even the merits of the person's case, go down substantially. Why? Because of this heuristic of wanting to feel fair. Now, this 4th person is completely independent from the last 3. Their cases have nothing to do with each other, and each one should be judged completely independently. But that's a very difficult thing for human beings to do who want to feel fair, because they feel like they've given 3 people one outcome, so the 4th should have the other outcome. That's a fairness heuristic, and that's bad, right? Because each person should be judged independently. The algorithm doesn't care. If there are 4 in a row that should be given or denied parole, no problem. In fact, if there's 100 in a row that just happen to be lined up and they all should be given or denied parole, doesn't matter. That's not a problem that the algorithm suffers. So that's what I mean by reducing an not a legal bias, but a non-legal bias. That's one example of a heuristic that algorithms are very good at helping humans overcome in rendering decisions. Secondly, the value of data science is that it increases the availability of information on which to rely for decisions. An example of that comes from studies on healthcare and health outcomes, particularly in oncology. So what they've found is very fascinating about predicting mortality rates when oncologists, who are trained medical professionals who all they do all day long is oncology, that's their specialty, their medical specialty, as compared to algorithms and data science methodologies for predicting mortality from oncological events. What they found was the oncologists focused on the markers and the things that they were trained on which to focus. But that was a subset, as it turned out, of lots of other information that were very predictive of mortality. So an example was, if you had a hospital stay that was for a serious illness in the last 7 or 8 years, independent of the oncological markers that the oncologists were observing, that predicted mortality, a large percentage of the variation of mortality rates associated with oncology. So this is an example, and the oncologists missed it because they weren't looking for hospital stays for serious flu, for instance, right? Influenza stays at hospital. They weren't looking at that because that's not a classic marker in the oncological field. Data science was, the algorithms looked at everything simultaneously and in relation to each other, and were able to render much more accurate predictions than even oncological experts. It's not to say that oncologists are bad at predicting. It's to say that oncologists armed with analytics, you would increase the availability, reliability, and accuracy of the information that's being put into the mix for rendering complicated and difficult decisions like predicting mortality in oncology. So that should give you a sense of the value brought to bear on decision making of analytics. Here are some examples of predictive model questions near and dear to my heart, particularly in the HR space. Which new locations are most likely to result in the ability to hire and retain the most talented employees? Site selection. Which of 3 contemplated policies is optimal to reduce turnover, reduce workplace conflict, and improve employee morale? Which applicants pose the lowest risk of theft or abuse of paid time off? And lastly, which employees are likely to voluntarily quit in the next 6 months? Turnover prediction modeling is surprisingly accurate, and I'll use that as an example when I talk a little bit more about data sources and how this works, because it is very interesting to think about the legal ramifications for pulling data from public sources and quasi-public sources for rendering predictions. Another example that's common and worth it to understand broadly in this space is SNA, or social network analyses, or just sometimes referred to as network analyses. This is a graph showing an organizational network, and each individual is a node represented by a dot on this network, and lines represent their communication or association or exchange with other actors on the network in this organization. You can use social network analyses to do lots of things. They're extremely powerful. Here I've given the example of using it to understand which individuals serve as critical network nodes or bridges among organizational groups. You can also use SNA as a way to, clients use SNA as a way to understand which employees are those that if they walked out the door would walk out and cause severe problems within an organization because of information flow. It's a great tool. It relies on, you can do this in conjunction with lots of data sources, like even looking at email meta fields, right? Like looking at the volume of times individuals correspond with other individuals in the organization. It's a great way to understand information flow and which individuals in an organization are critical for that information flow. Another example that I pulled that I thought might be useful here, just because the scope is important to understand what can be done here, using mouse clicking speed to interpret emotions, and one of my favorite things to do with big data, predicting lying, and something that's near and dear to litigators or anyone, but particularly lawyers and maybe litigators especially. This is an example of a study from the University of Michigan, which used pretty straightforward artificial intelligence methodologies to examine and predict who's going to lie in high-stakes court cases. And the University of Michigan's software used real-world data and was pretty accurate in predicting lying on the stand or in depositions, or could be used in any context. There are tons of applications like that of using data science as a way to predict things that maybe we're not so good as humans at predicting with our own intuition alone. And part of that comes from the availability of data. Like we said at the beginning, data sources and data storage have made high quality, high reliability, and highly reliable and high velocity information about people's behaviors readily available. So there are tons of public data sources for predictive modeling. There's individual level data, there are company data points, and job market data. In fact, I've found 60 some odd social media platforms from which to scrape, which means just to glean information in a systematic form about individuals and how they think, what their sentiments are, their expression of concern, fear, other sentiments that are very useful for predicting behaviors. And I should say, part of what's great about this newness of the availability of those data is that they're much harder to system game or fake, right? I love data that are hard to fake or system game. That's as a data scientist, those are my A+ sources of information. So heretofore in the HR space particularly, if you wanted to know how people thought or how they felt about the job, let's say, or whether they could feel like if they had a problem at work, if it could be resolved, we would rely on survey data. The obvious problem with reliance on survey data is the gap between how people actually feel and how they say they feel. And there are obvious biases of an employer, let's say, asking employees how they feel. For instance, one of my favorite questions on those kind of surveys is, do you feel that you are able to report to someone at this company if you had a problem at work? To whom do you feel like you could report? It's very rare that you get a response to that question that says, oh, I don't feel like I could report to anybody, certainly not the HR person at the company. Because most individuals feel like if they said that, they would either get in trouble or it may not be as anonymous or confidential as they are led to believe, so they may not trust that. There are a whole host of problems that are relatively obvious, I think, with asking people questions where they might suspect or have reason to believe that there may be a purpose beyond just wanting to know. So data sources that are behavioral, that indicate how people behave, or in some instances, their use of social media, which is exogenous to the actor, the entity that's measuring or figuring this out, has heretofore been very, very valuable in understanding and predicting how people are going to behave. And they're very powerful and very useful. Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and many others. Here's an example of one of my favorite pieces of information, again, publicly available information, and I blocked out the person's name and face, but this is someone who posted on, I believe this one is from Facebook, since KFC fired me today, the 11 herbs and spices are salt, pepper, basil, parsley, chili powder, lemon, pepper, thyme, sage, onion powder, garlic powder. So notice the person left off one of the herbs and spices, either because he's extremely clever or because he's not very good at counting. And if it's the latter, it's kind of funny because he was in the accounting department. So either he was super clever or not very clever at all. But either way, is this person someone who's likely to stay at his job? I'm going to say probably not. If you asked him that question at the job, would you get an accurate view of his personal predilection for his current employment? I'm going to say probably not. But that's a publicly available piece of information. And new high-velocity data sources are becoming available all the time. And this is a great example, this one here, because the movement in tech in this space and what we can do in this space in the next 5 to 10 years is perpetually being driven and amplified by, I think, good intentions, but you can quickly see, especially from a legal perspective, how these can go awry. So this is from a recent article noting that new wave in tech hacking the brain. And this is a system that enables, through understanding and monitoring and gathering brain waves, to be able to control motion. So you could think of this as a great application for prosthetics or other applications too that are great. But you can also see it as being very invasive of one's privacy because you can use those thought processes gathered and understand how people are going to behave in ways that are private and may not be acted upon, right? So the classic example that comes up in the HR or labor and employment space as being problematic here is, what if you pulled thought processes or gleaned thought processes from someone and you were hoping to get thought processes about how to optimize a strategy for a legitimate work purpose, but what was there was a crush an employee had on someone else, and those views were not necessarily appropriate for work. These are just thoughts in someone's head. It's very troubling to think of the Minority Report-esque implications for doing anything with that information from an employment standpoint or from an organizational standpoint writ large. So you could see how over time these things are very powerful at informing decisions in many contexts, but there's a lot of risk associated with them. And that's where I think law, legal services, and the market for professional lawyers in general can play more of a role. So what are the risks of a data analytic approach to decision making generally? So I would say that there are 3 categories of risk. Analytics done incorrectly yield suboptimal, erroneous, costly, and potentially legally wrong decisions. And this can be in the source of what are considered type 1 errors or type 2 errors. Type 1 errors are erroneous conclusions that the risk exists when it doesn't. Type 2 errors are a failure to properly detect risk. Now, in all instances, you have that system that I described earlier where there are features being put into a model and there are processes that are used to evaluate those features and then an output. Just thinking about prediction models for now. In that setup, if no one is paying attention to the legality of the feature set going in, that could yield risky or suboptimal or incorrect or illegal results. The same thing is true in risk detection models where you might erroneously conclude that there is no, let's just say you're looking to see whether there's discrimination. If you erroneously conclude there is no discrimination, when there is, that's a problem. The same way it's a problem if you erroneously conclude the opposite. In both instances, how is the employer charged with that knowledge? Is the employer charged with that knowledge? And to what degree is it the same as being charged with knowledge gleaned from other sources that are more common? So this is just an algorithm that's predicting things. It's blind. It doesn't understand things that are outside of the model scope. It's just looking at the features that are in the model. If the model is not complete, then you could have these suboptimal and illegal or problematic or risky incorrect conclusions, right? The second category of risk generated in this space are reports that are not protected by attorney-client privilege. These may result in discoverable smoking gun evidence in litigation. So here is a problem that I've observed very often at companies. Companies get very excited about performing data scientific processes to optimize decision making in the HR space, in the marketing space, in finance, across the board. And they get excited and they start running things. And by the way, as a data scientist, I can completely sympathize with that instinct. If you give a data scientist a ton of data and say, well, think about this and do something with it, those data are going to be analyzed and probably reports are going to be generated from those analyses. Now, it's very rare that you have data scientists that also understand the law. And it's very rare that you have data scientists that understand deeply the specific areas of law that are going to come into play when looking at analytic decision making that are relevant here. So it might be intellectual property law, it might be privacy law, it might be labor law, it might be employment law, it might be contracts, and others, tort. There are other areas of law that might be directly applicable here. It's very rare that you're going to have that situation, and it's even rarer that you're going to have a situation where the data science function can generate reports that are shrouded with attorney-client privilege, or in some instances even work product protection. Without that protection, one of, I think, the largest risks associated with data scientific algorithmic processes being used to render decisions are this exact point, where you have reports being generated that are not protected by attorney-client privilege. They're done internally in the organization, and that creates problems. So it's very important as counsel to organizations using data science in their decision making that those decisions are that we either advise them of the risk, and maybe even better than advising them of the risk, find ways to use the analytics by maximize the value of the analytic decision making while mitigating that risk of generating a smoking gun piece of evidence in litigation. And I will say, from watching this space a lot, there are absolutely instances in which people internal to a company are trying to do something that is going to move the ball and be very productive and great for a company, and they end up generating a report that carries with it a lot of risk. And I'll talk about that a little more in a second. And then the third category of risks associated with organizational decision-making, and this is somewhat related to the second, is what I refer to as insider analytics. So the problem with, or the drawback of insider analytics is that it's not always great to self-evaluate. So as anyone who's ever struggled with their weight or tried to lose weight may attest, myself included in this category, if you have a bunch of days where you're trending kind of heavier than you'd like to, or you've eaten badly for a couple days, what do you not want to do? Get on the scale. The last thing I want to do after a weekend of eating off diet is weigh myself on Monday. Why? Because I don't want to look bad. Even if it's just for myself, I don't want to do it. Now imagine if other people are evaluating me in terms of my performance, let's say. What's the last thing I want to do if I'm in an organization is evaluate myself with an objective measure like a scale or a data scientific approach to organizational decision making if I'm concerned that I'm not going to look good. Also, there's some devilish smartness in the details. What if I tweak the model a little bit to improve how I'm going to look? That's an instinct that's very hard to avoid, especially given what are called agency costs. Those are the costs of having agents within an organization who are self-interested. We're all rational actors, or some of us are rational actors within organizations, and being self-interested is natural. But it's very hard to have a rational, to juxtapose these two concerns of a rational self-interested agent of an organization and the goals of the organization writ large of generating reports and maximizing the value and minimizing the risk associated with those reports, because they want to look good. The example I always give in this context, as you see on the slide, the roach on the A sign on the report card for the inspection for the restaurant. You know, maybe the restaurant wasn't so good, but they, gosh darn it, they want to make sure they get the right grade. The other classic example is the 4 out of 5 dentist example, which I love. So you might be familiar with the 4 out of 5 dentists. What do they recommend? They recommend chewing sugarless gum. All right, well, the story behind that is a classic example of the drawback of insider analytics. The Warner Lambert Company, who made Trident sugarless gum, commissioned a market research firm to survey dentists in July of 1976. The research people came back with a list of about 1,200 dentists, and they were supposed to represent a cross-section of their profession. However, they were only dentists who mostly had expressed that they had patients who chewed gum. So the dentists who expressed this subset of patients, having the subset of patients who tended to chew gum, were asked what they would recommend to their gum-chewing patients: sugared gum, sugarless gum, or no gum at all. Now, if you think about it, no gum at all is almost like a non-answer because these are gum-chewing patients. So axiomatically, I think that third category would be ruled out. The only logical answer of those two choices is sugarless gum. But the end result was a report that said 4 out of 5 dentists, by the way, I don't know what the 5th dentist was thinking. Maybe he didn't understand the question. But 4 out of 5 dentists say you should chew sugarless gum is not really the right result. That disconnect between the methodology, where there is a lot of insider push to get an answer, and the result is a problem. Right? You might walk away with a conclusion that sugarless gum is good for you, or dentists think it's good to chew sugarless gum, or there's an advantage to sugarless gum, when the truth is most dentists would think, no gum is better than any gum. So the erroneous use and application or conclusion from the analysis is a product of this failure at the earlier stage of using insider analytics. So it's important to be appraised of these risks, to be able to inform clients of the risk, and to think about the legal risks associated with all of these forms of analytics. So you can see how analytics really is a double-edged sword. It's terrific for uncovering bias. That's one of my favorite uses of analytics. There are many instances where organizations are not aware that there are decisions being rendered in a biased fashion, legally biased fashion, either in a way that inures a benefit to one protected category or another, or is decreasing the value of a decision to a protected category. And analytics is an excellent tool for uncovering those biases. But here's the real important part to note. It is a double-edged sword, and while it can be great at uncovering bias and maximizing the value of decision-making, there are risks. And those risks are big, and they have been talked about quite a bit very recently. So in January of this year, 2016, the FTC came out with a report. And the report is called Big Data, a Tool for Inclusion or Exclusion, Understanding the Issues. And the FTC in this report identified these areas of law as being ones that employers who are, here's what the FTC advised, companies that, advises that companies should review these laws and take steps to ensure their use of big data analytics complies with the discrimination prohibitions that may apply. I would add to the list two other areas of law. So you have the FCRA, the ECOA, Title VII, the ADA, ADEA, FHA, and GINA. And the report's available online. I urge you to look at it carefully. essentially what the FTC is saying is don't use big data in a way that discriminates against individuals. Don't use it in a way that runs afoul of Fair Credit Reporting Act obligations, so things that might trigger the FCRA. And the FTC has gone after and in some instances settled with companies for use of data science as a way to forecast things about credit risk. And so obviously you have to be careful with the FCRA, anything involving housing, if you're rendering predictions that might have a discriminatory impact on people in protected categories. Age discrimination. Age discrimination comes up frequently, I've found, in site selection, where companies might be looking for certain demographic characteristics and not pay sufficient attention to output that that could potentially have a discriminatory impact on individuals over 40. And genetic information. The big issue here is health decisions. This is a real double-edged sword for data analytics. You could think of this in terms of being great for employees and terrible for employees or individuals generally. So data science can be great for predicting health outcomes, but you could see very quickly how this could run afoul of the law if those health decisions were used to discriminate based on other protected characteristics or otherwise impinge on individuals' rights in terms of both their privacy and their health records and information. So for instance, if there were a series of data scientific methodologies used to predict who's going to have diabetes or suffer from stroke or heart attack or serious illness in the next year, you could see how an employer might take that information and use it for great effect, perhaps by reducing healthcare costs and using those costs, defraying those costs across all individuals, all employees. But it could also be very problematic. Imagine a circumstance in which the data science can predict that you were going to have, person A was going to have a heart attack in the next 6 months or a year, and that information was never communicated to that person. Or imagine if that information were available, but it may not be right. What if there's a problem with the model? If it erroneously predicted, and you did communicate that information to the individual and said, hey, you're going to have a heart attack in the next 6 months, our data predict that that's what's going to happen. But that's not true, right? What happens in those cases is a question that lawyers should be involved in understanding and helping clients understand the risk based on these laws. The other two areas of law I would add to this list are contract. I think there are lots of spaces here where data can be used to make predictions and may run afoul of contractual obligations, both in the commercial setting and in the individual setting. And then lastly, labor law. So the FTC did not mention the National Labor Relations Act, but absolutely that also becomes an issue, particularly if you're using data science as a way to understand employee sentiment or other individual sentiment that might run afoul of their rights protected and guaranteed by the National Labor Relations Act to form a union or engage in protected concerted activity. So the other area, so now you have the analytics, you have this legal advice that's going to look at what features are going into the model, how, and on the back end, how the information that's coming out of the model is used, and doing as best you can to shroud things with attorney-client privilege when possible. Now comes the question of managing uncovered risk. What periodically happens, and this is how it materializes, is a report is generated that, let's say, is completely blind to gender. Gender is not in the model of predicting who should get a promotion, let's say. But here's something that comes out of that analysis. Here's the slide that shows predicted salary on the y-axis and current salary on the x-axis. And you can see I have this is just a simulated data, but the red dots indicate women and the blue dots are men. And you can see where the men and women are generally, even just from this graph, relative to the prediction line. So if you're above the prediction line, that means the model's predicting you should get more than you're getting, right, relative to your current salary. And if you're below the prediction line, that means you're getting more than the model predicts you should get. Notice the distribution of red and blue dots. You have more men who are, first of all, making more than women, And second of all, more men who are making more than the model predicts. Women tend to be making less than the model predicts. So this is a way for employment lawyers to, first of all, understand that even if a prediction model is not taking gender into account in predicting how much someone should get paid or what their bonus should be or whatever it is, law needs to intervene and, first of all, ensure that this risk is managed. It's first of all, it's observed, and then second of all, managed appropriately. A client needs to understand that these things can carry risk and can materialize in risk, and that risk is significant. The last thing you want is to have a report come out, no one looking at the effect of the report on things like protected categories like gender or national origin or race, and then have this document sitting out there that's completely discoverable in case of a suit down the road. So managing that risk is the big issue for lawyers. The last issue I'll raise before we conclude is, I think, the biggest one in this space for lawyers to in which lawyers should get involved, and this is privacy. So this is a quote from Forbes, a very recent Forbes article, saying, "Big data will face huge challenges around privacy, especially with the new privacy regulation by the EU. Companies will be forced to address the elephant in the room around their privacy controls and procedures." I couldn't agree with that prediction more. There are clear ramifications for pulling information that are public, but using them in the aggregate to form predictions around people. Plus, as I mentioned, there are new forms of information in this high velocity space that we're describing, from wearables, even brain waves, or other behavioral information that may or may not trigger privacy laws. That's something that requires legal expertise to understand. Gartner Inc. predicts that by 2018, 50% of business ethics violations will be related to data. I'm not surprised by that prediction, and I think that's right. It may even be higher than 50%. I would predict that by 2020, most privacy causes of actions will be related to data. That's not a surprise, particularly when you think about how all these claims that can be levied are already being used, data are already being used by folks on the plaintiff side of those cases. Lastly, I want to conclude by thinking about how prediction modeling can come into the legal space, not just as a form of understanding how our clients are rendering decisions, but how we as lawyers behave and make our own predictions of our own behavior. I think it's important for lawyers to think about how prediction modeling and big data can be used to understand risk around litigation and to understand predicting things like how many hours is it going to take to settle a case, for how much is a case going to settle, how much would a case be worth if it were tried, looking at things like opposing counsel, the judge, the jurisdiction, the types of claims, on and on and on. The same way we described earlier with the example of interviews. You could think of just tons and tons of features, arrays after arrays, matrices full of features that could predict variation in those kind of critical, important information in the legal space. There are movements being done. We at Littler are working on this, and others are working on developing those prediction models. But I would encourage lawyers to think of how those things can augment and improve their decision making, both for clients and our own behalf, to improve the practice of law. And I'll conclude with this slide of a centaur. And I'll give you the example of how critical and important it is for us to think about using analytics and big data analytics to augment and improve our decision making, both on behalf of our clients and on behalf of ourselves, as really the gold standard to which we should be pushing. It's not that predictive analytics should replace decision making. It's not that it should circumvent or subvert our intuition and decision making. We shouldn't feel beat up that we get it wrong in the 3 out of 4 case that I mentioned, that heuristic. But we should use analytics as a way to augment and improve our intuition, but not to push our intuition to the side too much. We're experts in our areas for reasons. We've developed deep knowledge and experience and expertise, and those things shouldn't evaporate when we're faced with an analytic prediction. Oncologists shouldn't give up because a model was better than they are at predicting mortality. It means they should use the models to improve their own decision making. And that's why I have this slide of a centaur. In 1997, famously, Garry Kasparov, who was a chess grandmaster, lost to IBM's Deep Blue at chess. And what we've learned since then is sometimes, even very recently with Go and Google, sometimes computer algorithms beat grandmasters who are very intuitive and very strategic, based, deriving from deep knowledge and experience, just like lawyers. Sometimes algorithms beat humans, and sometimes humans beat the algorithms. But what we've learned in the time since 1997 to present is that humans armed with the algorithms, so-called in chess, centaur chess players, those are humans armed with the algorithms that aid them in making the decisions, are unbeatable. They can beat the algorithms and they can beat the humans. So I think the most important takeaway here is that it's important to think about law's role and how law can inform and assist clients and also inform itself using analytics, but to always have in mind this goal of not replacement or an either or, but think about analytics as a form of augmented decision making, as a way to improve and continuously strive for better ways of improving decisions, maximizing the value of analytics while, and this is the key part for lawyers, minimizing or mitigating the risks associated with analytics. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Zev Eigen, the Global Director of Data Analytics with Littler Mendelson.